Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. You know who I am. You clicked on the link. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a man named Jack Hinson. First, I'd like to encourage y'all to check out Sasquatch Coffee. They have some interesting blends not available anywhere else on the planet. Things like Eye Shine Coffee or Tree Knock. You can find them at squatchcoffee.com. That's Sasquatch, but without the SA at the beginning. Organic Man Coffee Trike is now doing online coffee sales. You can find them on Facebook at Organic Man Coffee Trike, or if you'd like to place an order, go to www.organicmancoffeetrike.shop. You can get a bag of the Trike Blend, which is Julio's very own roasted coffee. You might like to check out coffee from Guatemala or Brazil. My favorite just happens to be the Peruvian blend. My latest book, Paranormal Laredo, was going to be published in the end of September, so it'd be ready for October. However, seeing as the UFO conference in Edinburgh has been rescheduled, I decided maybe it'd be a good idea to go ahead and publish it in May. That way I'll have another book to set out on my table when I'm down there in Edinburgh. Hopefully a couple of y'all will swing by and pick up a copy or three. After all, they make good Christmas and birthday presents. If there's somebody you know that you just can't figure out what to get them, buy them a book. Tonight's show was suggested by Lowell John Howard. I was surprised when he sent me the info. I'd never heard of Jack Hinson, which is a shame. As I did the research, I discovered this guy was something else. Now, maybe this might not be the strangest story you've ever heard, but it is definitely interesting. We all should know how the Civil War got started. The North was imposing their views on the South, and the Southern states decided they'd had enough. Slavery was an issue, but it wasn't the biggest driving force. I have found some people that will claim as many as 25% of the Southern landowners also owned slaves. Well, I found other people that will say it was more like 5 or 6%. Think about it. Most of the people living in the South were farmers. They didn't have much money. Not everybody lived on a huge plantation. Most had a small piece of dirt that they farmed, and that was it. Slaves were kind of expensive. Families had as many as 10 or 12 kids. Well, you had to feed the kids. Well, you had to feed the slaves. You could have as many kids as you wanted, and you didn't have to pay a dime for any of them. You had to feed your slaves, you had to pay for them. Back then, you could work your kids as hard as you wanted. They didn't even have to go to school unless you wanted to. In 1852, Massachusetts passed the first compulsory school laws. Other northern states followed, along with a few the next year. These were the northern states. It wasn't until 1918 that all the kids in the United States had to attend elementary school. I guess the actual number of slaves owned should be somewhere between maybe 8 to 15% of the people in the South. Along the United States-Mexican border, there were only 17 slaves recorded in any of the documents. Leading up to the Civil War, the country had two distinct forms of Masonic lodges. There were the Masons in the North and the Masons of the South. The Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction was founded in Charleston, South Carolina in 1801. This council was in charge of the goings-on in the states in the southern half of the country. Surprisingly, or maybe not, the states and the territories in the southern jurisdiction are also the states of the Confederacy. The nation was split along the border between the two jurisdictions of the Freemasons. The Confederacy decided to break away from the Union and become their own country. Alabama, Alaska, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. 11 states were going to form together and not let the folks up north tell them what to do. If you look at the Confederate battle flag, you'll see 13 stars, one for each state. Well, there were 13 states in the Confederacy. Kentucky and Missouri both joined later on. The first Confederate flag was adopted in March 4th, 1861, consisting of 3 stripes, alternating red and white, of equal width, and a square canton of blue with 7 5-pointed stars in a circle. 1 star for each of the states that had started out in the very beginning of secession. At the Battle of Manassas, July 21st, 1861, the Union and the Confederate armies met and they duked it out to see who was the biggest and the baddest. In battle, it was difficult to know who was standing on the other side of the field. To show which side you were on, units would display a battle flag. There was no actual line between the two sides. Units were moving around, and it was confusing enough without all the smoke generated by the cannons and the muskets. To make matters even worse, each unit was allowed to make their own flag. As long as it had the right number of stars, nobody said anything. The North had the stars and stripes, 35 stars, 13 stripes. The South had the stars and bars, 7 stars and 3 stripes. At a distance, the number of stripes and stars couldn't be determined. Flags don't stand straight out from the ground. They tend to hang down in a confusion of colors. Northern forces shot at Northern forces, and the Southern forces shot at Southern forces. The guys with the binoculars were all scattered about the edges. They would have to send riders down into battle to tell their subordinates who was who. Stop shooting at those guys over there. They're on our side. Old hunters and Indian fighters, before the Civil War era, wore blue or light gray so they wouldn't stand out at a distance. This tradition was carried over into the selection of Army uniform colors. Because the United States regulation color was dark blue, the Confederates chose gray. As soldiers were often at a loss to determine which side of the war a soldier was on simply by his uniform. With a shortage of regulation uniforms in the Confederacy, many Southern recruits just wore whatever they had on when they showed up from home. When clothes became scarce in the South, the principal source of Confederate uniforms became captured Union uniforms. The dark blue uniforms were boiled in a solution with walnut husks, acorns, and lye. The resulting color was a kind of a light tan, which the Southerners called butternut. You might have noticed I called it the Battle of Manassas. The North called it the Battle of Bull Run. Just about every battle in the Civil War had two names. The battle plans of the Union troops were always made in relations to rivers. Rivers that were right angles to the line of advance were obstacles that needed to be crossed. This was considered to be a place where contact with the enemies could be expected. Rivers that were parallel to the line of advance were natural highways along which troops could move into hostile territory and along which supplies could be brought by riverboat. The Confederate troops were fighting a defensive war, and they relied mainly on their railroads to convey supplies to their armies. They didn't really think about the rivers all that much except as natural defensive lines. The most important geographical features to them were cities and towns that they were trying to defend from the advancing Union armies. As a result, the Union tended to name any battle that took place near a river after that river, since it was the most important geographical feature in their battle plans. The Confederates named battles after the nearest town, since that was to them the most important geographical feature. Manassas was the closest town, and Bull Run was the closest river. I did have a few ancestors in the Civil War. Well, they lost. During any war, it was considered wrong to target civilians. War brings out some of the worst behavior. Rules are one of the first casualties. Put a bunch of men together and send them out with orders to find the enemy and kill them, but do it in a civilized manner. You can shoot, stab, beat, or blow up the guys in contrasting uniforms, but don't harm anybody not in uniform. Not everybody in the United States was pro or anti-slavery. Many people didn't even think about it. My neighbor owns a cow. My neighbor owns a wagon. My neighbor owns a few men. Folks were taught to mind their own business. Take care of what you had and stop worrying about the guy in the next county over. Most people never traveled more than as far as the county seat, and that was whenever they had to vote. Have you ever wondered why we vote on Tuesday? Back when you walked or rode a horse, you had to travel to the county seat in order to vote. It was considered wrong to travel far on a Sunday, farther than the local church. In order to get to the main town, people would set out early Monday morning, arrive in town, vote Tuesday morning, and then it was time to travel back home. And that is why we vote on Tuesdays. There were people living in the South that considered slavery to be a bad thing. They just didn't talk about it because somebody might take offense and kill them. There were people living in the North that were all in favor of slavery because it made them rich, even though they didn't own the slaves. Textile mills bought cotton from the South, made clothes using workers that were treated almost as badly as slaves. And now it's time for a rant. England just loves to say how they were kind enough to abolish slavery before the United States. They will proudly state this any time the subject of how the United States used to own people comes up. English abolished slavery with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, except for the East India Tea Company. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the East India Company relied on slave labor and they trafficked in slaves from West and East Africa, especially Mozambique and Madagascar, transporting them to their holdings in India, Indonesia, as well as the islands of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean. The East India Company, or East India Tea Company, had its own army. In 1800, there were 200,000 soldiers, which was more than twice the number of soldiers in the British Army at that time. The company used its armed forces to subdue people in India. The Indians were forced to work long, hard hours with no recourse. If a worker tried to run away, the East India Tea Company soldiers would hunt them down. They would be taken back to work, or they would be executed. By the 1820s and 1830s, the British had conquered parts of India and had intended to grow cotton in these lands so they could offset the amount of cotton they were having to buy from America. When this endeavor failed, the British realized they could grow poppies at an incredible rate. These poppies could then be turned into opium, which the Chinese wanted to buy. But there were laws in China against buying opium. There were laws against importing opium. So the British grew poppies in India, converted it into opium, and then smuggled it into China, which they traded for tea. Then they sold the tea back to Britain. The illegal opium trade was highly successful, and the drug was smuggled into China in extremely large volumes. The East India Tea Company sold opium to China to finance its purchasing of tea and other goods. The Chinese opposition to this drug trade caused the first, 1839 to 1842, and the second, 1856 to 1860, Opium Wars. When the British Empire won both of these wars, one of the agreements with China was that Hong Kong was to be ruled by Britain, which gave them a seaport into China. And now, back to the Civil War. John W. Jack Hinson, better known as Old Jack to his family, was a prosperous farmer in Stewart County, Tennessee. Stewart County is right on the border with Kentucky, northwest from Nashville. Jackson wasn't interested in politics, and he didn't think secession from the Union was a really good idea. On his tobacco plantation, he had slaves. In Tennessee in 1860, if you had a huge farm, you had slaves to work it. Jack's plantation was called Bubbling Springs, where he lived with his wife and 10 children. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, he was fiercely determined to remain neutral. He was 54 years at the start of the war. One thing Jack did that was a surprise was he freed all of his slaves. There was no pressure from any abolition groups, especially in Tennessee. Jack just decided it was not right for him to own another man. Once all the slaves were free, they all decided to stay on the plantation and work, only now they received money for their time. This should give you an idea of how Jack had treated his slaves originally. The first few battles between the states were won by the Confederate forces. How could this be? The North had a far bigger and better equipped army. Well, before the war, all the top military men were all trained at West Point. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Stonewall Jackson, Sheridan, George Meade, even Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States, all attended classes at West Point. Many of the Union generals were chosen for political reasons. whereas the generals from the South were picked because they knew how to fight. The generals running the Southern armies knew how the generals in the Northern armies thought. For example, a General McClellan was in charge of the Army of the Potomac. He had somewhere around 121,000 men at his command. A General John B. Magruder, who was also known as Prince John, had about one-third the number of men, maybe 40 or 45,000. To make it look as if he had a superior force, Prince John, knowing his army was being observed, would send small groups of men out through the brush and then have them march back into camp. This gave the impression there were new men arriving all the time. McClellan convinced himself he was outnumbered by the Southern army, and he refused to attack. Instead, he kept requesting more and more reinforcements. General Magruder was called Prince John because of his manners and his social grace. Now, at the time, just about everybody in the upper ranks of the military were very refined. You were expected to dance with the ladies and to be extremely polite. I wonder how much more over the top Magruder was to earn the nickname of Prince John. Ulysses S. Grant was not one of the top graduates from West Point. He managed to graduate in the top half of the bottom of his class. He was ranked 21st out of 39 men. Grant didn't look like a soldier. His uniform was never all that neat. He was short and he slouched. He was not known for his social graces. He was known for thinking fast and coming to decisions while in the heat of battle. This reminds me of Sergeant Kitchens from my home unit. He didn't look very impressive. His uniform looked like it was an afterthought. We tended to make fun of him when he wasn't around. Then one day, I saw him in his dress uniform. The ribbons on his chest ran from the epaulette all the way to the top of his pocket. I looked at all those wards, and I had to ask what they all represented. He had the Purple Heart 4 times. He had things I'd never seen before. It turns out Sergeant Kitchens used to be an officer in the Navy. He served 3 years in Vietnam on river assault boats. Once I got him to talking about just the tiniest bit of his career. Sergeant Kitchens went from being that guy to being that guy. He gained more respect in just that one incident than the whole rest of the company. Well, Grant managed to get promoted to Brigadier General at the beginning of the Civil War. Just about anybody with experience was promoted, and Grant had served in the Mexican-American Army, Mexican-American War. 2 of his first decisive battles were at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, where he was victorious both times. Having taken these strategic forts, the Union Army was now a permanent fixture in the area. Tennessee was a Confederate state. Most men who joined the Army were fighting for the South. Even 2 of Jack Hinson's sons had decided to put on gray uniforms. While General Grant was in the area, Hinson had him over to the house for dinner. This was followed by General Grant staying at the plantation for several days, using the place as his headquarters. Hinson was still staying out of either side of the conflict. A general didn't travel alone. When Grant turned up at Hinson's plantation, he would have shown up with hundreds of men. There would be messengers coming and going day and night. Everybody in the county would know that Hinson was being visited by these northern aggressors. After a few days, Grant packed his belongings, rallied his troops, and after thanking Jack Hinson for his hospitality, moved on. Since many in the region were sympathetic to the Confederacy, some turned to guerrilla tactics to deal with the better armed and trained Union soldiers. These became known as bushwhackers because they hid in the woods where they could attack Union troops, and then they would fade back into the forest. In World War II, these same folks would have been known as the Resistance. Since the Allies won World War II, the Resistance fighters are known as heroes. Since the Confederacy lost the Civil War, these men are known as bushwhackers. I have a photo of one of my ancestors who fought in the war between the states, or the Civil War, depending on if you're from the North or the South. He is shown sitting in a chair with his uniform on. It looks like his day-to-day clothes, other than the fact that he has 2 pistols, a huge knife, and a rifle. You wouldn't know he was in the Army. The Confederate soldiers used what they had for uniforms. Some states issued gray uniforms to their troops. The states didn't really work together very well. If you were a member of the Army of Virginia, you had a full uniform issued to you, more than likely. If you were in the 9th Texas Infantry, you might have gotten a grayish-looking jacket, a leather belt to hold all your Army gear. Most soldiers used what they had on the day they enlisted. None of the states were willing to share what they had. Units from neighboring states didn't receive supplies from each other. Each state acted as if they were in it all alone. As the Union soldiers were patrolling the land around Stewart County, they would encounter young men, sometimes old men, out walking around with a rifle. How would you know if this was a bushwhacker or some guy out hunting for dinner? 2 of Hinson's boys went out hunting for dinner. They were hunting on property owned by Jack. The sons were arrested by a Union patrol, who accused them of being bushwhackers, and they were executed. Their bodies were taken into Dover. The remains were dragged around the courthouse square, and then their heads were cut off and placed in a burlap sack. The patrol ran out to Jack's farm, and the sergeant placed the heads of Jack's executed sons on the gateposts of his fence. The soldiers then began searching Jack's home and the surrounding barns from top to bottom, looking for any kind of contraband, anything that might look like Confederate equipment. Stockpiles of rifles, bullets, gunpowders, that sort of thing. Jack and his family would have to have stood there with the heads of 2 of his children impaled on the front gate while the soldiers ransacked everything they owned. Jack and his remaining family were about to be arrested when word came from town that Brigadier General Grant would be very unhappy if anything more were to happen to Jack or his family. The lieutenant in charge of the Union soldiers turned his troops back to town. I would have gotten mad. Anybody would have gotten mad. Jack got very mad, and he decided it was time to take a side. And on that note, I am going to play a couple commercials and drink some coffee. So don't go away. I'll be right back. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Truck. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. In case you're hearing a squeaking, rattling noise in the background, I have to say that's Emily. Several months ago, I was over at the gym on Colton, and there was a little, looked like a grayish, brownish heap of fur laying on the sidewalk. It looked in really bad shape. Well, I asked around everybody in the gym, and nobody laid claim to the dog. Nobody said they were going to take her home, and nobody said they're going to try and get her back on her feet. So I took her home and gave her a bath, and it turned out she was actually white. Well, she managed to start walking, and then she managed to start running, and now she's learned to jump. So as I'm doing the show, she's standing beside my chair, jumping and hitting the side of the chair while I'm trying to talk, and that's making the chair squeak. So all that noise in the background is a formerly sick puppy that is now an overly aggressive, friendly pet. Okay, getting back to the show. Jack was a hunter. When you have one shot to either have dinner for your family or go hungry, people tended to get very good at shooting. Most soldiers were issued a musket. This was a long-barreled weapon that fired a huge chunk of lead, using black powder and a smooth bore. Once the lead left the barrel, it's accurate up to maybe 200 yards if you were lucky. They were used by both sides at the beginning of the Civil War, since they were cheap and easier to make and a lot faster to load. As each group of soldiers fired their muskets, a huge cloud of smoke would soon envelope the battlefield, making it impossible to see. Accuracy was not an issue. The men would line up, fire a few shots in the general direction of the enemy, or whoever they thought was the enemy. They would fix bayonets, and then they would charge across the field. A stabbing and clubbing was used more than shooting. Things got so confusing in battle, muskets and rifles have been found with several loads still in the barrel. The soldier was so intent on getting rounds off, he never knew he was just shoving things into the barrel, but never actually firing. Jack ordered a special-made rifle. It was a .50 caliber. A caliber is based on hundredths of an inch. A .50 caliber is a half an inch. The rifle had a set of grooves running the length of the barrel. This would cause the projectile to spin, which made it far more accurate over a greater distance. The rifle Jack ordered had a 41-inch hexagonal barrel. Most rifles were decorated since they cost a lot of money and people wanted to show off what they had. Jack ordered his rifle to be free of all decorations other than a silver front sight. He also ordered a mold so he could make mini balls. Muskets and most rifles fired round balls, easy and fast to make. You simply melted lead and dropped it from a tower. This was called a shot tower. The bottom floor was soft dirt so that as the lead cooled as it dropped through the air, it would hit the ground and it would be easily found. The shot was not all that uniform in size, so to load it, the shooter would wrap the shot in a piece of cloth called a patch. A French army officer, Claude Etienne Minet, invented the bullet that would bear his name in 1849. The Minet bullet, which was soon called the mini ball. This was a cylindrical bullet with a hollow base that expanded when fired. The expansion caused the bullet to hold the grooves in the rifle, making it spin as it exited the barrel, making the projectile far more accurate and much greater distance. The British Army used mini balls against the Russian forces during the Crimean War. After the outbreak of the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate soldiers slowly began to adopt the mini bullet in their muzzle-loading rifles as the necessary equipment became available. Instead of a shot tower, the bullets needed a mold. The production was slower, but the effect was far more devastating. There was nothing mini about the size. The bullets were anywhere from .45 caliber all the way up to .58 caliber. Jack's rifle was accurate up to 880 yards. That's over 4 times as far as a musket. In fact, it was over a half a mile. The first order of business: take out the men responsible for his 2 sons' deaths. Jack picked a spot where he could see the Union patrol as it approached. He knew when and where the soldiers would be at just about any hour of the day. He sat and he waited. As the patrol came riding along the road, Jack took aim and he fired. The lieutenant was dead before he left the saddle. With only 1 shot, the Union soldiers had to try to figure out where the round had come from. Jack was able to reload, take aim, and fire once more. This time he took down the sergeant that had been the one that had placed his sons' heads on the gateposts. The smoke gave Jack's position away, but he had already left. The soldiers tried to locate Jack, but he was long gone. He was hunting in his own backyard. He knew how to get from his hiding spot to safety. It didn't take long for the Union to figure out who was taking out their officers. Most soldiers were taught to aim for the other soldiers and fire. It was considered improper to target officers. After all, officers were not shooting at soldiers. Without officers telling the troops what to do, they would usually turn and run. Officers dead, time to go home. Even though it was midwinter, Jack didn't want to lose any more family members. Knowing things were only going to get worse, Jack gathered his family and they headed west, crossing the Tennessee River and arranging for his wife and kids to stay with some friends. Once his family was safe, Jack returned to his home. The Union soldiers had arrived at the plantation after the family was gone. The former slaves were still living there, having been given full run of the land. The man in charge told his men to burn it to the ground. The workers tried to intercede, but nobody listened to them. When Jack arrived, he found only the smoldering remains of his home. He told the workers where they could go to reconnect with his family, and then he went looking for some place to wait and make plans. Jack moved into a cave up on the mountains between the rivers. Jack was now looking for his next target. The Tennessee and Cumberland rivers were major transport hubs, so he frequented both. From his higher vantage point, he targeted Union boats, picking off captains and officers, as well as disrupting the flow of river traffic. From his hiding place, it was an easy climb to a high-angled shooting position. Shooting downwards gives you better aim. This allowed Jack to prey on Union officers. The Southern sniper had found the Achilles heel of the Tennessee waterway. Union boats struggling along the rapids always came to a standstill. The boats were frozen in place. Jack had plenty of time to steady his rifle and squeeze the trigger after selecting the ranking officer on the Union boat deck. At Fort Knox, we were taught how to salute. We were also taught when and where to salute, as well as when and where to not salute. We were told never salute while in the field, or a war zone. A sniper would figure out who was in charge and take them out. It wasn't always this way. Jack could sit up there on the ridge and look down at the men on the boat. He would see men saluting one guy on the deck. If everybody was saluting the same guy, it was apparent he was the top officer. Jack was looking to take out the men in charge since his sons were killed at the orders of Union officers. Shooting at anything from around a half a mile takes a lot of skill. I mean a lot of skill. I was happy to be able to hit the target from 50 yards. The further the bullet travels, the more things will interact with it. At night, during tank gunnery, we used tracer rounds. This would leave a bright trail through the air as the 105 millimeter round went down range. Some targets were way out there. Using laser range finders and a computer, our main gun was aimed in such a way that when I squeezed the trigger, the round would curve as it went so it would hit the target. This curve was caused by wind hitting the round and gravity causing the round to drop. It looked way cool at night. Jack had a rifle with open sights and his shooting ability. Kentucky windage is an adjustment made by a shooter to correct for wind or motion of the target by aiming at a point horizontal to the target's position in a sight rather than by adjusting the sight to compensate. You aim at where the target is going to be when the round gets there, or you aim at where the bullet needs to be as the wind affects its flight path. Today, snipers have digital range finders that tell them how far the target is so they know how high to aim. They have anemometers so they know how fast the wind is blowing so they can use Kentucky windage. It's an anemometer, not anemometers. They will usually have a spotter who will tell them where the missed rounds go so they can correct their aim. And they have some highly advanced optics, so they can even see their target. Jack had open sights and his skills. He hit his target more often than not. Jack Hinson and his deadly rifle became such a menace to Union forces that specific orders were issued to either capture or kill him. As a result, parts of 9 regiments, both cavalry and infantry, an amphibious task force of specially built Navy boats with Special Operation Marine Brigade targeted him. When you hear a gunshot, you duck. This isn't to avoid the round that is already fired. It has already hit its target, and if you're not hit, it wasn't you. This was to get to cover to avoid any shots coming next. You don't know how many enemies there are looking at you through their sights. You don't know if the shooter has more than one rifle. As the commanding officer would drop to the deck, leaving a huge mess where he had been, everybody around would dive for cover. This would lead to all kinds of confusion. It would take a few minutes to figure out there was only going to be the one shot. Then it was time to check out the major or colonel or general that used to be in charge. Whichever officer was next in command was now the next target. Although Jack Hinson never actually joined the Confederate Army, folks began referring to him as Captain Jack. He didn't have a uniform, but his clothing was subdued, making him hard to see even when close by. Being a hunter, Jack knew how to sit still for long periods of time and how to blend into his surroundings. One of the most spectacular stories of his career was when an entire boat of Union soldiers surrendered. After he had fired on the boat, the captain thought he was being attacked by Confederate soldiers. To avoid further bloodshed, the captain beached his boat. Then he raised a white flag and waited for the soldiers to arrive and take him and his men into custody. Jack, being all by himself, couldn't very well take an entire boatload of soldiers into custody, so he slunk back into the woods around him. I wonder how long that captain and his men sat there waiting for the Confederate Army to show up before they realized that they hadn't been captured. Sergeant York, one time, did capture an entire platoon of German soldiers by himself, but that's another story. British soldiers in India, as early as 1773, hunted snipe, which is a small, quick bird that was very difficult to shoot. Successful shooters were dubbed snipers. However, the true sniper as we know him today was not a British idea. The term sharpshooter had been used in the British Army since 1801. The experimental group of riflemen had been set up by the British Army in 1800. This led to the creation of the 95th Rifle Regiment in 1802. As a specialist sharpshooting force using the Baker rifle. The guys using the Sharps rifle just kind of borrowed the name. Although several armies had special marksmen, it wasn't until World War I when the German army exploited the proficiencies of the sniper by equipping their sharpshooters with scoped rifles. Soon after discovering the German scopes, the British Army started setting up specialized sniper schools themselves. Well, Jack was not called a sniper or a sharpshooter. He was called a marksman because he could hit his mark on a target. He could move from place to place, picking out a strategic location and then sit and wait. As the patrol would come into view, he would pick out the man in charge and remove him from his saddle. One shot, one kill. Then Jack would slip into the trees and make his way to some safe spot, while the soldiers were still trying to figure out where the shot had come from. There were Union spies everywhere looking to earn a few dollars and stay in the good graces of the folks in charge. Then there were Confederate spies looking to avenge any wrongs done to them by these invaders. Invaders? Well, before the Civil War, each state was considered to be more like its own country. Most had their own ideas as to what was right and what was wrong. People living in any state not yours were considered to be foreigners. My wife and I drive all over the country seeing the sights. Anytime somebody asks us where we're from and we say Texas, it's as if we're from some far off distant land. I hate to put it this way, but people talk funny in other parts of the country. Now I imagine no one ever traveled around very much back then. You knew who lived in your county. You saw them in town. You might meet somebody from some distant state. On occasion, somebody might move in nearby from way over in the next state. Folks would greet them and act nice around them, but there was always going to be suspicion. Those people are from some place not here. The new folks would have to live in the area a long time before they became part of the community. As men in the Union Army began marching around ordering the locals to do things, anger would grow. How dare these foreign invaders come to our community and tell us how to live? When word would spread that there was this guy, a legend of a man, who was setting things right, people wanted to help him. This led to a lot of folks passing on information to Jack so he could take out the enemy or run away and hide if a trap was being set. Any Union patrol out searching the countryside had to move slowly enough so that the men could watch in every direction. The officers began to worry about not coming back from some routine trip. When you can't relax all day, your nerves will get frayed. This leads to a lot of mistakes. Though he remained apolitical, Jack began helping the Confederate Army. In November 1864, he guided Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest to Johnsonville so he could attack Union Supply Center. Some of you are going to get confused by some of the rank structure in the Army. Lieutenant General is over a Major General, which really sounds wrong. Here is how you figure out who is who. Say to yourself, "Be my little general, general." B is for Brigadier General. He would have 1 star on his collar. This was followed by my for Major General, 2 stars on his collar. Little was for Lieutenant General, 3 stars. And then there is a general, which is a 4-star general. The highest rank is General of the Army, but you don't see many of those. The United States didn't have any 5-star generals until World War II. Other countries had them, and so Eisenhower was made a 5-star general since he was the supreme commander. In the Navy, a 5-star rank is the Fleet Admiral. So now you can say, "Be my little general," so you know who is who. Nathan Bedford Forrest. You probably know the name from the movie Forrest Gump. Nathan was born into a poor family, and he spent his formative years in rural Tennessee and Mississippi. When his father died, Nathan became the head of the house. It was now his job to earn a living to support the family. Despite his nearly non-existent formal education, he was able to secure a measure of financial stability for his family. When his mother finally remarried, Nathan struck out on his own. In 1845, he married Mary Ann Montgomery. The two had 2 children, but only one survived to adulthood. Forrest eventually became a millionaire, having made a fortune trading livestock, brokering real estate, planting cotton, and selling slaves. By the outbreak of the Civil War, he was one of the richest men in Tennessee. Shortly after the start of the war, Forrest enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army. But he soon discovered being at the bottom of the food chain in a war was not the place to be. Being a man of wealth, Forrest knew the governor of Tennessee, who arranged for Forrest to be promoted from private to lieutenant colonel. Now that's a jump in rank. Having money and knowing horses, Forrest was put in a cavalry unit. In the war's early months, Forrest earned a reputation as a doggedly, sometimes brutal, determined commander who exercised a natural insight for battlefield tactics. "Get there the first with the most" was one of his sayings. Forrest took part in the defense of Fort Danielson, Tennessee, in February 1862. When the commander of the fort had decided it was time to surrender, Forrest refused to follow orders and instead took his men and escaped. A huge mass of men on horseback storming out the gate right after the white flag was hoisted must have shocked the Union soldiers so much they would have dove for cover, allowing the Confederate force to escape. Forrest was promoted to colonel and fought with distinction at the Battle of Shiloh, April 6th and 7th, 1862. During a retreat from battle, Forrest was wounded, which was only one of multiple wartime wounds. After leading a new command to a dramatic victory over Union forces at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in July, Forrest was promoted to brigadier general, now 1 star on his collar. After his promotion, Forrest began acting as a semi-independent cavalry communication commander. His command conducted raids against Union supply and communication lines, depots, and garrisons in many states in the war's western theater. Forrest's campaigns were especially detrimental to Union General Ulysses S. Grant's Vicksburg campaign. Some contemporaries and historians have argued that Forrest delayed Vicksburg's fall by several months. In May 1863, Forrest stopped Union Colonel Abel Straight's attempt to cut the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which was a vital supply line for the Army of Tennessee. Forrest was at the Battle of Chickamauga in September 19th and 20th, 1863, where his Union held the Army's right flank before pursuing the retreating Union forces. General Braxton Bragg, the Army of Tennessee's commander, stripped Forrest of his command because the two got into an argument, probably over Forrest going after the Union Army. You weren't supposed to just break ranks and do what you wanted to, but, well, that's how Forrest did things. Forrest was known for arguing with superior officers all the time. He even threatened to kill Bragg. Bragg never reported the incident, knowing how valuable Forrest was to the war effort. Forrest refused to take any further orders from Bragg, and he resigned. Confederate President Jefferson Davis promoted Forrest to Major General, 2 stars, and moved him to a different division. War brings out the worst in people. April 12, 1864, Major General Forrest was tasked with capturing Fort Pillow. The fort was manned by black soldiers, Union sympathizers, and deserters from the Confederate Army. When the Union Army refused to surrender, the Confederates stormed the fort, killing just about everybody inside, especially all of the black soldiers. Not every hero was a shining example of who you wanted to be, and not every villain was a monster. In war times, things happen that in hindsight should never be. That's war for you. In 1864, Forrest, who was now a lieutenant general with 3 stars, wanted to attack the Union supplies stored at Jacksonville, Tennessee. He didn't want to run into any Union forces that might delay or stop him from his objective, so he reached out to the locals for help. Captain Jack said he could guide Forrest and his men through the back country and up to the outskirts of Jacksonville. Back then, there were few maps that showed what was actually around. If you were lucky, you would have a map that would show some of the rivers and some of the roads, and they weren't all that accurate. Having somebody like Captain Jack who knew the countryside like the back of his hand was a massive plus for Forrest's army. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman described Nathan Bedford Forrest as the most remarkable man in our Civil War produced on either side. As the Confederacy's disruptor-in-chief, Forrest specialized in lightning cavalry raids, and his assault on Johnsonville was a culmination of 3 weeks rampaging through western Tennessee. Arriving on the Tennessee River, he captured 2 steamboats and used them to transport his artillery to the west bank of the river opposite the town. Spotting the activity, the flotilla of Union gunboats was sent to attack Forrest's position. In response, the bombardment of Forrest's artillery captain was devastatingly effective, destroying 4 Union gunboats, a host of other vessels, and inflicting massive damage on the town's supply depot. That night, Forrest departed as quickly as he'd appeared. Using the light of the enemy's burning property, they maneuvered their way through the forest and vanished. In the melee, Forrest had only lost 2 men. He had also significantly impeded Sherman's plans. Nathan Bedford Forrest went from being a poor farmer to being a millionaire. He went from being a private to lieutenant general in 4 years. Like him or hate him, he is by far one of the most interesting men coming out of the 1800s. By the end of the Civil War, which did not end at Appomattox Courthouse like a lot of folks think, the last battle of the Civil War was the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. It was fought May 12th and 13th, 1865, on the banks of the Rio Grande, just east of Brownsville, Texas, and a few miles from the seaport of Los Brazos de Santiago. Captain Jack suddenly found himself without a cause to fight for. He could still go around shooting people if he wanted, but with the end of the Civil War, he decided it was no longer the right thing to do. Shooting people in a war is one thing. It's what you did. Shooting people during peacetime is considered murder. Jack Hinson hung up his rifle, rallied his family and his workers back to his land, and began to rebuild. It is believed by the end of the war he had shot and killed between 100 and 130 enemy soldiers, almost every one of them an officer. He had lost 7 children from 1961 to 1965, 2 murdered by the Union soldiers, both of his daughters who had developed measles. 2 of his sons had joined the Confederate Army and either died in battle or from wounds shortly after. He had 1 more son who had joined a guerrilla unit and had fought, who had also died in battle. Jack died April 28, 1874, and he was buried in the family plot in Cane Creek Cemetery. To this day, he is still considered to be one of the most successful snipers in the history of the military. Judge Ben Hall McFarland owns the rifle that Captain Jack carried throughout his military campaign. The judge keeps the rifle in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and he shows it off anytime there's a Civil War gathering. Judge McFarland just happens to be a direct descendant of Captain Jack's. Like I said, Captain Jack never actually joined the Army, but he was considered to be a captain. Kind of like Colonel Sanders, I guess. He was given the rank by somebody, and he hung on to it. Even though he never actually joined the Army, he was not considered to be a murdering bandit. He was very much fighting for his cause. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends. If you didn't care for it, sorry. Send me an idea that you'd like to hear, and I'll see about making a show out of it. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?